All right, good afternoon. I am calling to order our regularly scheduled meeting of the Intergovernmental Relations Committee. My name is Elizabeth Glidden. I'm the chair of this committee, and I'm joined today by Council Members Fry, Cano, Council President Johnson, and Councilmember Andrew Johnson. We're a quorum of this committee. We have 3 agenda items for today, and I think Mr. Ranieri is taking the lead on all 3 of these. The first is a 2017 mid-session update. Mr. Ranieri.
Madam Chair, there's been a technical difficulty, so I will need to redo the computer.
Okay. And maybe Diana, do
Okay.
you need some assistance?
Sure. Okay,
Yeah.
Can I get started?
Sounds like we need some assistance here, please.
Madam Chair, members, my name is Chief Ranieri. I'm the Director of Government Relations for the City of Minneapolis, and Ms. Bergman and Ms. Lesh are at the Capitol. Right now, the debate is on the Senate floor on the so-called preemption bill. We are at the midpoint, or really beyond midpoint a little bit in the session. The first slide we have here talks about the schedule, and where we're at right now is the conference committees are beginning to meet. Matter of fact, all the conference committees will meet at least once this week. They will go through the traditional working through the bills, comparing the bills to each other, looking at the spreadsheets, taking public testimony, and then waiting to come back next week. What they will all be waiting for will be what are their financial targets. And that's something that should be, hopefully will be decided soon. Those, in the meantime, if there are no targets, and sometimes those targets don't come till early May, they will work on the policy language differences. They will accept the same and similar languages, and then they will probably, if there are some big issues, they can probably decide without, where there is no money, they will do those. So they've started the process. Unlike prior years where we had members on those conference committees, the city of Minneapolis and other cities, we only have 2 members on conference committees this year. One, Representative Omar, is on higher ed, and Senator Champion is on the Jobs Conference Committee. One of the things in talking with the council, the committee chair, is what are some of the themes for this session? What are some of the overall issues? Well, one is limiting local decision-making authority, and there's lots of those kinds of bills happening. As you may be aware, when we get to slide 10, there'll be more examples, but the League of Cities is keeping track of all of the bills that sort of limit what cities can do, what counties can do, what local governments can do. And I think we're up to about 25 different bills that have been introduced. Many of them are in bills that are in conference or on the floor of the House or the Senate. Others aren't moving, but it's an issue that's really where you're seeing the state trying to take away some of our local decision making. Another one is the changing role of state government. Many of the state government agencies, particularly in the DNR bill and the government operations bill, are seeing the legislature imposing themselves on the rulemaking process. In some cases, not only revising rules or maybe even requiring approval of rules in certain cases. They've also are spending more time in looking at setting up commissions to look at certain things in departments, particularly things in state government like number of employees, the amount of money being spent on salaries, lots of management on the executive branch. Another major issue is the shifting long-term budget priorities. We went through the $6 billion deficit a couple of years ago. We now have a surplus. The governor's budget had some tax relief in it, but also was trying to make sure that in the subsequent years and subsequent bienniums, there were dollars there. These budgets, particularly the tax bill, really spends an awful lot of money this year as well as commits to the future, particularly in some of the income tax proposals that are both in the House bill and the Senate bill. It is probable that those will see a reduction possibly in those budgets as we move on. Another thing is the change in approach towards achieving racial equity. Last year, there was a commission in the Senate. There was several hearings. There was about a $35 million budget for those programs, and many of those programs were supposed to roll over into the next biennium, the biennium coming up. What we see is a reduction in funding. The House bill has around a $10 million appropriation for jobs as compared to 35 last year. The Senate Special Commission or Special Subcommittee is not there, and there is really no mention in the jobs bills of any sort of racial equity programs. Continue to focus on Greater Minnesota. There is, and you're seeing it in almost every area where there's an impact that, the metro area is being pitted against Greater Minnesota, and more resources are being used to go to Greater Minnesota. And we're seeing it in all areas. For example, the Job Creation Fund is focusing on Greater Minnesota. There's some changes in workforce housing, again, emphasis in certain counties of the state. And then there's reductions, of course, in Metro Transit and putting some more money into roads in Greater Minnesota. There are hopefully opportunities for bipartisanship, especially in the Senate, because there's only a one seat or one vote majority in the Senate. So we'll see as things go along that maybe there will be some bipartisanship. And the governor has talked about some of the bills that he wants done and he will sign. He wants to see some bipartisanship. Madam Chair, now trying to go through the area of local government finance. The House Omnibus tax bill, as you can see, is a $1.3 billion spending target as compared to $900 million in the House. So there will be some movement between those numbers. In that House, there's no change in LGA. There's no penalties for cities except for cities that will fund a World's Fair or operating unauthorized diversion programs. There's a driver diversion program that was, I think, ruled by the courts to not be in compliance with state law, and I think it's in southeastern Minnesota, but we have a diversion program, and it is in conformity with state law. There's the construction sales tax exemption refund for local governments. That has been delayed for a couple of years. It is in the House bill. There's 3 new reverse referendas, one of them for franchise fees and other types of activities that cities would be subject to. And there's several income, state general levy tax changes. The state general levy tax change is a reduction of 10% of the levy for C&I property, and it excludes the first $200,000 of C&I property from the state tax. It will not impact local taxes, but it would definitely impact the taxes paid overall by a business. The Senate spends about $400,000 less, and there is a cap in the LGA on the city of Minneapolis. It says that we can receive no more than $50 million starting in 2018. That's a $28 million reduction. That was a floor amendment. It was offered as an amendment to an amendment dealing with education credits. It was assumed that once that amendment went on and the author would withdraw the bill, he did not withdraw the bill, and it was adopted, and it's now in the tax bill. We have worked with leadership on both sides to try and get that taken out. It's not in the House language, but it is in the Senate language. There's also a $12 million one-time increase in LGA funding. However, we need to get the $28 million out first. And then there are many income and state general levy. Their general levy tax change is a 10% reduction, but it's on the first, and they have an exemption for $100,000 of value. Local government finance. This is the government operations omnibus bill. House has a $90 million target. The Senate has around a $30 million target. The key here is that PERA receives from the state payments for MRF, and as a part of state law change back in 2015, the local governments, the local government employers, ourselves and the school board and the county and the park board and MAC all contribute, and we were contributing $31 million a year. Starting in 2017 and 2018, we were supposed to contribute 21, and the state would go from 6 to 16. The House bill changes that and makes $6 million permanent all the way through 2031, which means we, as a city, will have a $5.6 million reduction in our aids in 2017 and subsequent years. However, in the Senate, they do not do that. The Senate leaves it at 100% and does not change that formula at all. So that's going to be a major discussion in conference committee. In capital investment, the Senate, they have a Senate file waiting on the floor. There it's about $1.6 billion on projects, 1.4 on bonding, 200 in general fund, 25, of course, the Lake Street and I-35W Transit Access Project is in that bill. There's also money for Pioneers and Soldier Cemetery. There's money for housing infrastructure bonds. The House bill has not yet been released. It's our understanding that if you were in last year's bill, you have a very good shot of being in this year's bill, but the bill has not been released, and we expect it to be released probably near the end of this session, probably in late May. In transportation, this could be probably one of the pieces of policy that may not happen this session. The governor would like to infuse more funds into the transportation system. This House Transportation Finance and Policy Bill reduces the Metro share for Metro Transit by 50% for its operating budget. It increases the deficit, as you see on the charts. It will require cuts in routes and service hours, and shifts motor vehicle sales tax from Metro Transit to suburban transit providers. It expands bus service in the Southwest and Northwest metro areas. There probably will be fare increases, and I guess there's concern about a drop in ridership. And it also shifts metro mobility shortfalls to the local bus service. So Metro Transit, under this transportation proposal in the House, will have a very difficult time, and it will make it very difficult. And again, we have lots of folks who work in our city who come by transit every day.
Mr. Ranieri, can you
Yes.
go back? One more, I guess. Yep. So that item that says shifts Metro mobility shortfall to local bus service, can you explain where Metro mobility is funded right now? Is it from the overall Met Council budget? Because I know the Met Council's responsible for Metro mobility.
Madam Chair, it is.
At least in its coverage area.
It is covered by, it is in the Metro Council's budget, and they do receive some general fund funding from the state. So it's a combination of state funding, if I understand it correctly, and some of their own resources. And I will check on that, I guess, because I know whatever the cost of the fare is doesn't cover the expense.
So then what's the shift? Are they removing the state funding?
The state funding would cause either local taxes, or the Met Council would have to find other resources for Metro mobility.
So how's the shortfall covered today? I guess I'm not understanding.
Yes, the shortfall is covered today by it's my understanding, and I'll confirm this, is from the state subsidy.
I see. So they're removing that state subsidy, is what you're
yes.
saying. Okay.
The Senate Transportation Finance and Policy Bill has a new program called Active Transportation Planning that's more focused on bikes and pedestrians and non-motorized, and it provides $15 million in funding. I think if I remember correctly, this was an amendment offered by Senator Dibble on the Senate floor. It allows the improvement CTIB to increase its sales tax by 1/5% for transit and metro, but it has to be by referenda, subject to voter approval. And that was another amendment on the floor by Senator Latz. Moves $511 million to the tax distribution fund. It's moved from the general fund, and that's taking sales tax from certain transportation-related items. Is when you buy a part. If you're going to change your oil filter in your car, that generally, right now, that sales tax goes to the general fund. If this proposal goes, it would go not into the general fund, but into the transportation fund. So auto parts, lease car rentals, things of that nature would all go out of the general fund into the into transportation funds, so it would leave the general fund short. It borrows money for road and bridge infrastructure. It leaves Metro Council deficit about the same. Requires 17% cuts in hours, again on Metro Transit. And again, they have a $25 million shift. And then it ends the state's commitment to fund 50% of the future light rail operations. And it also should be mentioned that any sort of future light rail would need legislative approval. And regional governance, and this is slide 10, dozens of bills introduced that impact local government decision-making. We're aware of the bill that's been dubbed the preemption on local wage benefit requirements. That's being debated on the Senate floor as we speak. There's also a prohibition on local banning or taxing of plastic bags. That is in the Environment and Natural Resources bill. Small cell wireless bill would allow for unregulated access to our public right-of-way. We have an ordinance, the city has an ordinance on that, and this is being debated and opposed by the League of Cities because the industry itself is trying to impose a sort of set of rules that would be applicable to all cities around the state. And it's in neither bill, it's neither in any of the conference committees, and negotiations are still going on. Reverse referenda bills, and then the one I mentioned, there's a repeal of the city authority to establish special service districts. It's in the House bill, but not the Senate bill, and we're not really sure where they're. The only testimony we heard were some folks from the North Loop who were concerned about their fees, and this is a Representative Drazkowski bill that's in the House. I think it's in the House tax bill. There's new restrictions on interim ordinances, and then there's more information, more notification on business notification requirements. And when that bill first started, it was going to require, I think, a first-class mail. That has all been changed. I think the League of Cities has worked on this, and it may not be as onerous as it was before. The House and Senate bills modify the Met Council creation membership. Some of the bills increase membership from 17 to 27. They remove the governor's ability to appoint members and a chair. Membership could include 7 county representatives, 1 from each one, appointed by the county board. Then there would be 16 municipal representatives, 1 from each district would have to be designed, and those representatives would be appointed by newly created municipal committees, which would be representatives of the cities in that district. And it's my understanding, I think it would be an elected official who would be appointed as a Met Council member. The Commissioner of Transportation and 3 other folks would be appointees. So in effect, what we're basically setting up here is a COG, a Council of Governments, and this really membership mirrors what we now have for TAB, Transportation Advisory Board. It would eliminate the board, and the House bill also requirement of legislative approval, as I mentioned earlier, and then a fare box recovery objective of 40% by 2022, which is higher than what we do now. I think it's around 28% today. So it'd be a fairly high bar to try and reach. In public safety and criminal justice, the House Public Safety Omnibus bill, unlike the Senate, includes policy. The Senate is basically a funding bill and doesn't include a lot of policy. The House Public Safety Omnibus bill, it requires 16 continuing education credits to cover crisis intervention. This is for police officers and for new recruits, mental health crisis. A lot of this is the 21st century policing that President Obama's commission recommended, and this is being proposed. It's in the bill, and it was proposed and authored by Representative Cornish. So it requires a lot of the training, mental health crisis, conflict management, mediation, and community diversity, recognizing values. All the things talked about in the President's Commission are being funded and being authorized in this bill. The driver diversion programs are made permanent. Right now, they every 2 years get reauthorized. They would change ticket notification, change to the tickets. Notice of the surcharge and driver diversion program indicators would all be there. Indicator of collision. In other words, there'd be boxes on a ticket now to tell you how much is being paid for the surcharge, and that a driver diversion program is available. Geographic restrictions, a bill dealing with, we had a Supreme Court decision saying we can't do geographic restrictions because it wasn't part of a contempt of court. That's proposed. I think it's in the House bill. And then there's $360,000 to combat sex trafficking.
Mr. Ranieri, we
Yes.
have a question from Council President Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Ranieri, back on the mandatory court appearance under the driver diversion program, what does that mean?
Madam Chair, the Council President Johnson, can I get back to you on that?
Sure.
I don't know.
Yep.
Okay.
I apologize.
That's right. Thank
Not
you.
my area, but I will ask Melissa. Okay, thank you. There's also a provision dealing with protests. This is increases the penalty from a misdemeanor to a gross misdemeanor. It's not in the Senate bill, but it is in the House bill. The House bill also has allows for housing offenders in non-publicly owned facilities. There is one in Appleton, Minnesota, a private prison, and it's not no longer. I think it's vacant today. And then there's bills dealing with firearms. There's stand your ground and you don't need a permit to carry, and they are both individual bills. They're going by themselves, and I don't think there's any companions in the Senate. As I mentioned before, no policy changes, and they include $59 million in new spending. All is to fund employee and inmate health care. In affordable housing, the request is $100 million in bonding. There's $30 million in funding from Minnesota Housing Finance Agency and the Department of Human Services, and also some language dealing with allowing more and more communities to do local housing trust funds like we do here in Minneapolis. City livability and community well-being, the Health and Human Service bills, which are both rather large bills, both have taken some rather significant reductions in their targets. There is funds for safe harbor for sexually exploited youth, the requirement of comprehensive strategic plans to address the needs of sex trafficking statewide, an increase in the minimum Medicaid assistance reimbursement to $140 for evidence-based public health nurse home visits. So some good things there. The House bill also funds SHIP and directs some of the money, $3 million, to fund statewide tobacco quit lines. And then there's some no change in the local public health grant. There was concern there may have been some reductions in local public health. The Senate fully funds SHIP, but requires at least 2 grants for opioid prevention. And yesterday, the Federal Department of Health and Human Services released, and I forget the amount of money, to be used for opioid prevention, and Minnesota is receiving around $5.4 million. So hopefully some of that can be used here. And then a local public health grant, 1-year delay of 7.7 to be for FY19. There was also concern that that would be eliminated. In workforce development, as we mentioned earlier, there is little or no money for equity. There is money for summer youth, both from the workforce fund and from the general fund in the Senate. The House Jobs Bill deletes equity dollars and creates a $10 million base funding or a competitive grant called Pathways to Prosperity with a competitive grant process. And then there's an interim ordinance and plastic bag ban in that bill. The Senate Jobs Bill includes some equity appropriations from 2016, but at a reduced level, and I think I'll get those numbers to you. It also includes $2 million for the North Market. And in the House Jobs Bill, there's $350,000 for East Phillips Neighborhood Initiative. Real ID, they met the conference committee on Tuesday. Some of the major differences are funding. The Senate funds the proposal. They think it's going to cost about $3.2 million to get Real ID up and running. There's also some difference about that classification of data. And then the Senate has language saying if Real ID goes away, here's how we would do. This is what we would do. The House does not have that. And there's some concerns, also some differences in timing. If you apply early for a Real ID, say your driver's license expires in 2019, but you apply for a Real ID in 2018, the House and Senate treat those applications a little differently. One, I think, would be free. Others is a small charge, and that needs to also be discussed. That conference committee should come back next week. The Sports Facilities Authority, the House has a standalone, and then they also put it into the government finance omnibus bill. The Senate bill has not yet been on the floor. We should probably see it next week. Both House and Senate address the use of suites, organizational structure, and policies and procedures to improve transparency. In the House, they establish a board that includes people appointed by each legislative caucus, one person from each, one person from the city of Minneapolis appointed by the mayor, one appointed by the governor, and one appointed by the Legislative Oversight Commission, which would have to appoint a CPA. So there would be 7 members in the House, on the House view. The Senate doesn't change the composition of the MSFA board, but it does require Senate approval of all appointments. Differences include the disposition and use of the suites. The disposition of the suites in the Senate bill, they would like to keep the suites and use one of them for nonprofit activities, especially for charity. And there's actually a study required in the Senate bill to come back and explain how to best do that. The House would try and return these seats back to either the primary tenant, which is the Vikings, or someone else. And so that would be a major difference in discussion. Both bills have a lot of requirements about reporting who uses the suites, what's the purpose of the suites, who the people are, and what was any money spent for food and parking on those suites. On the liquor, the Omnibus liquor bill passed out of the Senate. They both include extended service hours for the Super Bowl and a license for a restaurant in Upton Avenue South. The House bill should be taken up probably next week, and the governor has signed the Sunday sales bill. Madam Chair, I'll stand for any questions. And
I'm not seeing questions. You know, I think all along it's good to be aware, and we know that a lot of these issues will be part of the final negotiations, and there are some very real impacts on the table to the city and to our financial wherewithal, very serious implications. So I think we'll just continue, and thank you very much to you and your staff, which I know are working extremely hard.
Thank my staff for this. One thing I forgot to mention is that in the House bill, there's also repeal of the library debt service aid, which is $4.1 million. And if that happens, it would start in 2018.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, with that, I'm going to go ahead and move to receive and file this presentation. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That item is approved. Next, we have item number 2, and I'll have Mr. Ranieri kind of go through all of these, but we believe that we have a need for the city to reflect our position a little bit more fully in some letters. Maybe I'll just go ahead and kind of describe this a little bit more. The first letter would be something that is a little bit different because we do not yet have a formal city position on the Trump administration's proposed 2018 budget, but we would like to do a letter statement on that. And so that actual letter will come back so that the council gets a chance to look at it, and we hope to be able to view that at the committee of the whole. The items 2 and 3 are on issues where we do have policy positions adopted by the council, and we, again, feel the need to reflect our position in a more fully stated letter. And so this would be us giving authority. So, Mr. Ranieri, why don't you take us through any more comments on these 3 items, why we think the 3 need our comments right now, what's the timing issue?
Madam Chair, on the first one, on the federal, it's the governor has sent a rather detailed letter, and we thought it would be good to do the same thing to our congressional delegation, letting them know what the March 16th budget proposal of the president would do to our city. We also are going to note in that letter that we will get back to you after the president releases his May more detailed budget, and we will have that letter ready for next week. On the second letter, I think that letter is almost ready to go. I think Ms. Lesh has that drafted. That's the transportation at the legislature. And the third letter, we are putting it together and should be ready hopefully within the next couple of days. And that deals with the equity funding.
All right. Any questions from council members? And of course, anyone who wants to view these letters, they're going to be available to you. I think on the transit letter, we have been going back and forth on what's really the right strategic approach. Sometimes we send a letter that's just from the transportation chair, Councilmember Reich, or different things like that. And we think actually on this we may ask the council to sign the letter. So if that's the case, we'll be forwarding that around fully to the council. So I will move approval then of all these directions to draft letters with their associated follow-up. Any discussion on that? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, and that item is approved. And finally, we have an item relating to the National Endowment of the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities funding. Mr. Ranieri.
Madam Chair, as part of the President's March 16th budget, he recommended basically eliminating funding for the National Endowment for the Arts, Humanities, Public Broadcasting, and I think a Legal Services Corporation, which I think may be legal aid. We have a rather robust arts community here in our city. Matter of fact, when I looked at the National Endowment for the Arts, some of the things I discovered is that Minnesota, its amount of funding received is one of the highest on a per capita basis, or just one of the highest in the country. The National Endowment for the Arts, I think, is about a $50-some million annual grant program, and we this year received $5.6 million for folks all over the state. NEA was established in 1965 as part of President Johnson's Great Society program. He's also established was a National Institute of Health. They went through some growing pains during the so-called cultural wars of the 90s. They used to fund, the NIH used to fund individual artists. They moved away from that and are now going to nonprofits and organizations. And they sort of make sure that every congressional district gets a NEA program. One of the things that they have stressed more recently is focusing on access for all people. People of color, low-income folks, elderly, access to the arts. And they have also funded, for example, in our city, Juxtaposition Arts has an NEA grant. We received an NEA grant, I think, a couple of years ago for the Art Town program. There's also NEA funds in many of our theatrical organizations here in the city and also some of our neighborhood organizations. And I'm looking for the list. And some of them include the Guthrie and the Walker, of course, MIA, but also some of the smaller groups, Mixed Blood. If you give me a second, I can find it. Oh, here it is. Cedar Cultural, Pangea World Theater, in the Heart of the Beast Theater, Hmong Cultural Center. And I just named those that are in Minneapolis, but they're all over the state. The other thing I noticed when we were looking at this is some of our applicants, including the Guthrie, and I think Mixed Blood and others, receive funding to develop a play or some sort of art presentation dealing with immigrants and refugees. The Guthrie will be doing a play this year. It's going to be a premiere. It's going to be called Refugia, and it's about refugees from Syria. So NEA is also not helping for access. It's also trying to talk about issues that impact society today. Madam Chair, some of the other things they do, it's about almost 2/3 of their funds go to small and medium-sized organizations, which tend to support projects that are in small communities. They benefit audiences that may not otherwise have access. Most of them, 40% of their money is that activities take place in high-poverty neighborhoods. About 1/3 go to organizations that reach underserved populations. And they also have special programs for veterans. One of the things in our research we discovered in talking to folks from the art community that they have a program at they fund a program at Walter Reed to help veterans coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq and help them through the arts to rehabilitation. So, Madam Chair, that's just a quick overview. And one of the reasons we thought it was important is when last time we met, we talked about the impact of the President's budget proposed on our enterprise. And I think you mentioned, well, we also have partners. And this is a good example of the partners, all of the art organizations who receive funding from NEA, and we partner with them in some of these activities. So there will be others. We're going to be looking at other things and we will be bringing in a new federal agenda sometime in the next couple weeks. And we may be seeing, and we'll be reporting on what the President's proposing.
Thank you, Mr. Ranieri. And then I thought there was one additional issue, which is that there's now a proposal that's kind of caught up in this continuing resolution voting about cutting the NEA's existing budget for 2017. And so that's sort of the more immediate timing issue. I think there's going to be a vote on that at I can't remember the exact date, but the end of April. So it's coming up very, very soon. And so that's just another reason for us to communicate. And there may be, I'm sure there may be other communications that we want to send to our delegation, but for us to send this particular communication as soon as we can to our delegation to shore up their efforts to fight for this.
I think the deadline is, or the date is April 28th is when the continuing resolution runs out. And if it's not renewed, there could be a shutdown. But there is a proposal from the OMB to reduce NEA in 2017. I think it was a $17 million cut.
All right. So I'm going to go ahead then and move approval of this resolution. It does not, I think, specifically say this, but we would ask that this be communicated directly to our congressional delegation and others as identified by the IGR staff. Any discussion on that motion? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed. And last time I wanted to mention is that the Minneapolis Arts Commission has already had, I think, some robust discussion of the need for the city to make a formal statement on this. So I just wanted to say thank you to the Arts Commission members, which are residents in our city, and Gulgun Kayim from the City of Minneapolis Coordinator's Office for their efforts to prepare these materials and make sure that we're aware of the need for action now. So with that, I believe we have concluded with our business for today. Seeing nothing further, we are adjourned. Thanks.